Everything has to be paid for. Iraq held the world's fifth largest proven oil reserves when the United States invaded in 2003. Libya held Africa's largest proven oil reserves when NATO intervened in 2011. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves and has been under economic siege since 2014. South Sudan's independence in 2011 was supposed to bring prosperity through oil wealth. Instead, it triggered a civil war over who controlled the revenue. In every case, oil was not incidental to the conflict. It was the conflict. This episode examines how petroleum functions simultaneously as the objective of war, the financing mechanism that sustains it, and the geopolitical leverage that determines its outcome. Oil and conflict are not separate systems. They are the same system, and understanding one without the other is like reading a balance sheet with half the columns missing. Control the oil, control the conflict, control the outcome. Oil is the objective. The simplest and most direct relationship between oil and conflict is the one that is rarely stated openly. Wars happen where oil is. This is not conspiracy. It is geography intersecting with economics. The Rand Corporation's analysis of military intervention decisions in oil-producing states identifies a statistically significant correlation between a country's oil reserves and the probability of external military intervention. States with proven oil reserves exceeding 10 billion barrels experience military intervention at rates 3 to 5 times higher than comparable states without significant hydrocarbon resources, according to Rand's dataset covering interventions between 1980 and 2020. Iraq is the clearest case study. Pre-invasion Iraqi oil reserves were estimated at 115 billion barrels, the fifth largest in the world. Iraqi oil production capacity, if fully developed, could have generated $50 billion to $80 billion annually in export revenue at 2003 prices. The stated rationale for invasion was weapons of mass destruction. The economic rationale, securing access to and influence over one of the world's largest hydrocarbon reserves, was never formally acknowledged but was extensively documented in pre-invasion planning, according to declassified U.S. government documents analyzed by Brookings and other research institutions. They said, the invasion of Iraq was motivated by security concerns and the elimination of weapons of mass destruction. They got a post-invasion oil sector that remained unstable for over a decade, production disruptions costing an estimated $500 billion in foregone revenue between 2003 and 2015, and a conflict whose true economic logic was inseparable from the reserves beneath it. Oil as the financing mechanism. In conflicts where external sponsors are absent, oil becomes the primary funding source for the war itself. This creates a perverse feedback loop. The resource that makes a country strategically valuable also makes the conflict over that country self-financing. Libya illustrates this mechanism. Pre-conflict Libyan oil production ran at approximately 1.6 million barrels per day, generating $30 billion to $40 billion in annual revenue. During and after the Civil War, control over oil export terminals became the primary economic battleground. Rival governments and armed factions competed not for territory in the conventional military sense, but for access to the ports through which oil revenue flowed. The Libyan National Oil Corporation reported that oil production fell to as low as 150,000 barrels per day during peak conflict periods, a 90% reduction from pre-conflict levels. Each side that controlled production capacity used revenue to fund its own military operations. The conflict was, in economic terms, a war over a cash flow, and the cash flow funded the war that was fought over it. South Sudan presents an identical pattern at smaller scale. Independence in 2011 was expected to deliver oil-funded prosperity. South Sudan holds an estimated 3.2 billion barrels of proven reserves, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. But the conflict that erupted in December 2013 was fundamentally a dispute over who controlled oil revenue allocation. Production fell from 350,000 barrels per day pre-conflict to below 150,000 barrels per day during active fighting. The armed factions fighting over political power were simultaneously fighting over the revenue stream that financed their armies. They said oil wealth would provide South Sudan with the economic foundation for stable governance and development after independence. They got a civil war in which oil revenue became both the prize and the weapon, production collapsed by over 50%, and the country descended into one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Oil as geopolitical leverage. Oil does not only fund conflicts directly, it functions as geopolitical leverage, a tool through which external powers exert pressure on conflict dynamics without deploying military force. The United States and European sanctions against Venezuela, imposed beginning in 2014 and expanded through 2019, were designed to cut off Venezuelan oil revenue and pressure the Maduro government. Venezuelan oil exports fell from approximately 2.4 million barrels per day in 2014 to under 700,000 barrels per day by 2019, according to OPEC production data. GDP contracted by an estimated 50% over the same period, according to IMF assessments. Hyperinflation destroyed household savings. The population experienced one of the worst economic collapses in modern Latin American history. The sanctions achieved their economic objective, collapsing Venezuelan oil revenue. Whether they achieved their political objective is debatable, but the economic mechanism is clear. Oil revenue is the lever. Control the revenue and you control the economic trajectory of the state. This is not military warfare, it is economic warfare conducted through petroleum markets. Iran faces a structurally identical dynamic. U.S. sanctions reimposed in 2018 targeted Iranian oil exports directly. Iranian oil production fell from approximately 3.8 million barrels per day in early 2018 to under 2 million barrels per day by 2020, according to OPEC data. The economic contraction that followed, GDP declining by 6% to 9% annually during peak sanctions pressure, was a direct consequence of oil revenue suppression. They said sanctions on oil exports would force political concessions without causing large-scale civilian economic harm. They got GDP contractions of 6% to 50% in targeted states, civilian populations bearing the cost of revenue suppression through inflation, unemployment, and reduced public services, while the targeted governments retained power. The production destruction cycle. When conflict disrupts oil production, the economic consequences extend far beyond the producing country. Oil markets are global. Supply disruptions in one region affect prices worldwide, and the cost of those price increases falls on every economy that imports petroleum. The International Energy Agency tracks the relationship between conflict-related supply disruptions and global oil price movements. Their analysis shows that each 1 million barrel per day reduction in global supply due to conflict generates an average price increase of $10 to $20 per barrel. Iraq's production disruption between 2003 and 2005, a reduction of approximately 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day from pre-invasion capacity, contributed to a global oil price increase estimated at $15 to $30 per barrel during the same period. For the global economy, each $10 per barrel increase in oil prices reduces global GDP growth by 0.2 to 0.4 percentage points, according to IMF modeling. The conflict in Iraq did not only cost Iraq, it cost the global economy through higher energy prices, reduced economic growth, and increased inflation in oil-importing nations. The bill was distributed worldwide, paid by consumers and businesses that had no connection to the conflict. The resource curse, why oil wealth increases conflict probability. There is a well-documented paradox in development economics. Countries with abundant natural resources, particularly oil, tend to experience slower economic growth, weaker institutions, and higher rates of violent conflict than comparable countries without those resources. This is known as the resource curse, and it operates through several mechanisms simultaneously. Oil revenue concentrates economic power in the hands of whoever controls the state apparatus. This makes political control extraordinarily valuable, not for ideological reasons but for financial ones. Capturing the government means capturing the revenue stream. In states where oil constitutes 50% or more of government revenue, Iraq, Libya, Venezuela, South Sudan, Nigeria, the incentive to seize or maintain political control through force becomes proportional to the size of the oil budget. The World Bank's analysis of resource-dependent states shows that countries deriving more than 60% of their export revenue from a single commodity experience civil conflict at rates 2 to 3 times higher than comparable diversified economies. The mechanism is not mysterious, it is economic. Oil creates a prize worth fighting over, and the prize is large enough to justify the cost of fighting. Nigeria illustrates this at scale. The Niger Delta region produces approximately 2 million barrels per day, the majority of Nigeria's oil output. Armed insurgency in the Delta began in the early 2000s and has persisted in various forms ever since, driven primarily by disputes over revenue allocation between local communities, regional governments, and the federal state. The economic cost of the insurgency, in terms of production disruption, infrastructure damage, and security expenditure, exceeds $10 billion annually, according to Nigerian government and World Bank estimates. The long account. Oil is not a cause of conflict in the way that ideology or territory can be causes. It is a mechanism, one through which conflict becomes rational, self-sustaining, and geopolitically consequential in ways that wars over other resources rarely achieve. Iraq's oil reserves made it a target. Libya's oil revenue made its civil war self-financing. South Sudan's oil wealth became the prize that armed factions fought over. Venezuela's oil exports became the lever that external powers used to collapse its economy. Iran's oil production became the target that sanctions campaigns aimed at. In every case, the same resource played multiple roles simultaneously: objective, financing mechanism, and leverage point. The economics of oil and the economics of conflict are not parallel systems. They are the same system, operating through the same channels at the same scale. The total economic cost of conflict-related oil disruptions, measured in foregone production, price increases, and geopolitical destabilization, runs into the hundreds of billions annually across all active and recent conflicts. This cost is not paid by the parties fighting. It is distributed globally through energy markets to every economy that depends on petroleum. Oil makes conflicts more likely, it makes them last longer, it makes them more expensive, and it makes their consequences felt by economies that never fired a shot. Subscribe to The Price of Conflict, because the most valuable resource on Earth is also the most reliably destabilizing one.